letter Marx wrote to a friend in 1843. I discuss many aspects of the book. I discuss many aspects of Marcuse's book. But the main theme has to do with Marcuse's concept of nature. Nature is central to one of his most important early works, his essay on Marx's manuscripts of 1844, and also to one of his most important later works, One-Dimensional Man. The book explains the relation between these episodes in his intellectual development. That is what I'm going to discuss today. Marcuse's concept of nature is of direct relevance to us now because we are so deeply engaged with technology and the environment. So the study of Marcuse is not simply academic, but of political significance. I'll try to show you how in the course of this talk. Marx's manuscripts of 1844 were his first significant attempt to develop a theory of capitalism. He did not publish them at the time, and they remained among the documents that finally ended up in the archives of the Soviet Union after the revolution. The manuscripts were finally published in 1932, and they had a big impact because they seemed to show a Marx much more concerned with normative questions than in his later work. Marcuse wrote one of the first interpretations of the manuscripts, also in 1932. His interpretation was deeply influenced by his own background. As I will explain, he was a student of Husserl and Heidegger. Their thought colored his approach. In the manuscripts, Marx argued that human beings are natural beings, in contrast to the idealist emphasis on consciousness and thought. Marx claims, furthermore, that as sensuous natural beings, human feelings and passions are, quote, true ontological affirmations of being. By this, he seems to mean that human feelings and passions are not simply accidental facts, but belong in some sense necessarily to the nature of reality. Marx furthermore describes the human being as a species being. This concept refers on the one hand to the fact that human beings are conscious of themselves as human, and on the other hand, that their flourishing takes place in community with other humans. Finally, a third feature of the manuscripts has to do with labor as the concrete relationship of human beings to nature. Marx calls this objectification, by which he means that human beings institute their needs and faculties in nature in the built environment. The manuscripts argue that human beings are natural beings, but not in the simple physical sense alone. Some element here remains of the idealist notion of the unity of subject and object. The flourishing of human beings through nature and culture is also the flourishing of nature itself. Objectification transforms nature, not only superficially, but ontologically. Marx alludes to this when he writes, quote, "The sun is an object, a necessary and life-assuring object for the plant, just as the plant is an object for the sun, an expression of the sun's life-giving power and objective essential powers." Quote. But, Marx argues, the unity of subject and object is broken by alienation. And this is what makes revolution an ontological necessity. Marcuse was taken by the ontological references in the manuscripts. It seemed to him that ideas developed by the phenomenologists Husserl and Heidegger were relevant to Marx's conception of nature. Phenomenology was the most important trend in German philosophy in the early 20th century. The phenomenologists rejected naturalism. They argued that experience is ontologically fundamental and cannot be reduced to a subjective overlay on the nature of natural science. Husserl introduced the concept of the Lebenswelt, the life world, by which he meant the essential connection of lived first-person experience with the world. Heidegger developed a similar concept, which he called being in the world. His term Dasein refers to the human subject in its active role engaged with the meaningful things surrounding it in a world. This too is a kind of subject-object unity, although no longer based on the idealist concept of consciousness. Marcuse developed an experiential ideology. You know, my slides here are a problem because I can't see them until I post them. So excuse me if I look back.
No problem.
Marcuse developed an experiential ontology on the basis of a synthesis of Marxism and phenomenology. This is not orthodox phenomenology or Heideggerianism, nor is it so-called orthodox Marxism. Marcuse explained that the objective facts by themselves are incomplete because they leave out the form in which they are entwined with what he called, quote, historical human existence, end quote. This concept has to do with lived experience of social reality. Facts are not merely facts, but need to be understood as they impinge on experience. Here is a simple-minded example of Marcuse's point. Consider the number of windows in your house or apartment. You may find it difficult to recall their exact number. On the other hand, if you imagine yourself walking through your house, looking for the windows as you go, you will find them all quite easily. These are the same windows that would be listed as facts in an inventory, but in the walkthrough, they are entwined, as Marcuse says, with your lived experience, and as such are part of what Marcuse calls human existence. A more significant example would contrast the facts about a workplace with the way it is experienced by those who live it. Marcuse writes, while the scientific method leads from the immediate experience of things to their mathematical logical structure, philosophical thought leads from the immediate experience of existence to its historical structure, the principle of freedom. End quote. Existence here refers to the individual subject in its lived world. Note that Marcuse does not claim that one of these two modes of knowledge is superior. He writes, quote, no method can claim a monopoly of cognition, quote, but only the study of existence is relevant to the question of human freedom. Now let us see how Marcuse interprets the manuscripts in terms of these concepts. He treats the manuscripts as an experiential ontology. This is not explicit, but it is my interpretation of what he's doing here. Nature in the manuscripts is not the scientific nature, but the nature of lived human experience. Marxist categories, such as sensuousness and objectification, are not causal categories, nor is the mere fact that human beings have a physical body philosophically significant. What is important is the lived relation of the human being to nature. This encompasses the body as it relates to nature through feeling and need. This quasi-phenomenological approach leads to some unusual interpretations of the manuscripts. Marcuse interprets Marx's concept of species being as access to the universal, that is, to the lived meanings of natural objects. The human being is in an active relation to a world of meanings. That active relation takes the form of labor, through which human life is objectified in nature. Objectification is not just something human beings do, but is the mode in which human beings participate in nature. In this respect, objectification has a resemblance to Heidegger's concept of Dasein, as to say, the subject of an active relation to meanings. Objectification opens the domain of reality, the experienced world. Marcuse later writes, quote, truth is attributable to nature, not only in a mathematical, but also in an existential sense. The emancipation of man involves the recognition of such truth in things, in nature, end quote. All this leads Marcuse to a new interpretation of the concepts of alienation and revolution, but that is for another occasion. At this point, I want to show you two passages from Marx's manuscripts that echo throughout Marcuse's later work in the 1960s. We will see how they play out in One-Dimensional Man later in this talk. Here are the passages. First, Marx writes that unlike animals bound by need, quote, man constructs also in accordance with the laws of beauty. You'll see that this concept of beauty plays an essential role in Marcuse's understanding of science later on. Here now is a second passage in which Marx discusses science and technology. Again, this will prove relevant to Marcuse's later work. So let me read the passage from 1844. Marx writes, industry is the actual historical relation of nature, and therefore of natural science, to man. If, therefore, industry is conceived as the exoteric revelation of man's essential powers, we also gain an understanding of the human essence of nature, or the natural essence of man. In consequence, natural science will lose its abstractly material, or rather its idealistic tendency, and will become the basis of human science, as it is already becoming, albeit in an estranged form, the basis of actual human life. And to assume one basis for life and a different basis for science is, as a matter of course, a lie. Quote. So here you can see Marx discussing objectification, not only as a human act, but also as engaging nature itself in its essence. And that must therefore require a transformation of natural science. So I will come back to these passages soon. But first, I should say something about Marcuse's development after World War II. His early work is quite academic, but something happened in the 1950s that led him to produce works with much more obvious political relevance. In 1955, he published Eros and Civilization, a synthesis of Marx and Freud. The book presents a utopian perspective on the possibilities of a radically different form of human life and society. Then in 1964, he published One-Dimensional Man, which projected a pessimistic view of life in advanced capitalist society. It is as though he had moved from utopia to dystopia in the course of a decade. These books appeared originally as rather adventurous academic books But as the New Left and counterculture developed in the late 60s, they became popular. Literally hundreds of thousands of copies of One-Dimensional Man were sold in this period. I recall seeing a poster advertising the Italian translation of One-Dimensional Man in every bookstore in Italy during a trip there in the late 1960s. By this time, Marcuse had become a celebrity. He spoke at rallies in the United States and Europe and became one of the key theoreticians of the New Left. He was the face of the Frankfurt School around the world and a major figure in the political controversies of the time. Marxism was in crisis in this period. The Soviet Union appeared as a disaster from the standpoint of most people in the West. Its promise of liberation was betrayed. The New Left was explicit in its rejection of the Soviet version. I know this may have been a bit different in Italy, but certainly in the US and France, Britain, this is the case. The working class of advanced capitalism no longer seemed interested in making a revolution. Regulation and the new technologies had made capitalism acceptable. The mass media and consumerism seemed to have solved the riddle of history. In this context, Marcuse's work appeared as a radical reconstruction of Marxism. The dystopian prospects envisaged in One-Dimensional Man canceled all determinist versions of Marxism. The potential for socialism was there in the rich societies created by advanced capitalism, but consciousness was controlled so successfully that few desired revolutionary change. Marcuse emphasized the new role of technology, which no longer simply acted as means of production, but had now become an ideological resource for capitalism. Paradoxically, his pessimistic vision evoked resistance and struggle. By 1968, Marcuse's 1964 dystopianism was distinctly out of date, yet the threat of dystopia continued to motivate the New Left. It seemed as though new possibilities could emerge, and emerge they did. Anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, feminism, all testified to the limits of the system. Of course, in France, there was May 68, and in Italy, a great deal of turmoil, all motivated by the kinds of concerns that Marcuse developed in One-Dimensional Man. Today, the environmental movement and the movement for climate change continue the struggle in the domain of technology. Marcuse's writings in the 1960s contain three different critiques of technology, all of which are still relevant. The first critique considers technology as ideology. Technology frames a way of life and induces a conservative mentality. Most people come to believe that social problems can be solved by technology. What used to be considered political or normative issues are now treated as technical problems which experts can handle far better than the public. The individuals seek fulfillment in consumption and accept their place within a technocratic society they cannot understand and do not need to understand. Where ideological discourse used to fool the masses, now concrete technical achievements do the work of reconciling them to the injustices they suffer, more or less unaware. The second critique concerns Max Weber's concept of rationalization. Capitalism is a rationalized society in the sense that it uses techniques of calculation and control to organize production, distribution, and the bureaucracies. These rational methods are embodied in management and the management science, which explains how to organize effective action. But, Marcuse argues, rationalization in this sense presupposes control from above, and such control is a characteristic requirement of capitalism, not of rationality as such. Thus, rationalization, as Weber conceived it, and as it is conceptualized in management science, is biased by capitalism. Socialism, as the democratic organization of collective action, appears irrational from the standpoint of this dominant conception of rationality. What applies to management also affects the way in which technology is understood and designed under capitalism. Technologies of control are privileged over technologies that presuppose democratic engagement by workers. Socialism is eliminated at the outset by a conceptual sleight of hand. The third critique interests me most because it returns to Marcuse's concerns in his 1932 essay on the manuscripts. According to this critique, technology and science have become the dominant understanding of reality in advanced capitalism. They form the implicit ontology of the society. Marcuse writes, quote, "When techniques becomes the universal form of material production, it circumscribes an entire culture. It projects a historical totality, a world," end quote. World in this passage should be understood in terms of Marcuse's version of the similar phenomenological concept. Lived experience is now entwined with the world technology creates. In One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse follows Husserl in arguing that science reflects the life world. The capitalist life world is about domination of things and people. This, by the way, is Marcuse, not Husserl. Physics has become the paradigmatic science which establishes the nature of reality for modern society. Physics works with the primary qualities of objects, aspects that can be measured and quantified. It eliminates values and potentialities, which are now considered merely subjective. Marcuse argues with Heidegger that the underlying structure of physics is technological, in the sense that a quantified reality is adjusted to the demands of instrumental control. Marcuse writes, quote, "Science, by virtue of its own method and concepts, has projected and promoted a universe in which the domination of nature has remained linked to the domination of man." Quote, "That is to say, science, by its very nature, is adjusted to the needs of capitalism." If science is bound up with capitalism, then socialism would seem to require a different science, a successor science. Recall Marx's manuscripts of 1844, quote, "In consequence, natural science will lose its abstractly material, or rather its idealistic tendency, and will become the basis of human science," end quote. Marcuse follows up this astonishing notion on the basis of an idiosyncratic reading of Husserl and Heidegger. Domination is not the only form of instrumental action. Cultivation and artistic creation are alternative forms that will be privileged in a socialist society. A new science will reflect the change in the life world under socialism. The new science will valorize secondary qualities in lived experience, especially potentialities. Marcuse argues that aesthetics exemplifies these aspects of experience. Recall the statement in the manuscripts that, quote, "Man constructs also in accordance with the laws of beauty," end quote. Art reveals life-affirming potentialities that reflect human possibilities of growth and natural flourishing. These potentialities and the aesthetic faculty that reveals them are objective in the sense that they belong to experience generally and not just to subjective taste. But how would physics be transformed to incorporate potentialities? Marcuse rejects regression to a qualitative science like that of Aristotle. This seems to leave no way to actually implement a successor science. One-dimensional man, Marcuse puts off the day for the transformation of science until the establishment of socialism. But this does not solve the problem of principle. Toward the end of his life, Marcuse became aware of the environmental movement, which challenged existing science and technology to recognize aspects of nature favorable to human life. The struggle for nature did not have to await the achievement of socialism, but was part of the struggle against capitalism. This new approach, based on environmentalism, has implications for Marcuse's ontological critique of science and technology. One-dimensional man contains a concept that can serve this new approach while offering a more plausible path to scientific and technological change. Marcuse introduces the concept of translation, derived from the French philosopher of technology, Gilbert Simondon. The objects of science and the designs of technology can be said to translate concepts and demands elaborated in the life world. Marcuse writes, quote, "The historical achievement of science and technology has rendered possible the translation of values into technical tasks, the materialization of values. Consequently, what is at stake is the redefinition of values in technical terms as elements in the technological process. The new ends, as technical ends, would then operate in the project and in the construction of the machinery, and not only in its utilization. Moreover, the new ends might assert themselves even in the construction of scientific hypotheses, in pure scientific theory," end quote. This is objectification by another name. In these terms, technology can incorporate values and potentialities without all the problems that arise from the notion of a successor physics. In fact, this is routine. Think of the role seatbelts play in protecting human life. The value, life, is translated into the design of an artifact, the seatbelt. The materialization of values for which Marcuse calls has political significance today. We are hoping for the translation of respect for the climate in a revised energy system. I have developed similar ideas in more detail in my work on technology. The key is the relationship between technical disciplines and technology. These disciplines, unlike physics, are far more permeable to social demands. Marcuse only theorizes one of them, management science. He shows how its object is socially constructed by capitalism. What we call management is a conceptual object biased by capitalist assumptions. But that object could be conceived differently in a society based on cooperation rather than control from above. These considerations on management can be extended to all the technical disciplines that structure an advanced capitalist society, including those that design technology. Engineering, architecture, food science, computer science, education science, and so on, all work with conceptual objects that reflect the social world and are materialized in technological designs. Such disciplines use science and scientific methods in a variety of specific social contexts. Their objects, like management, are socially constructed in accordance with the demands of social actors. With these concepts, we can build on Marcuse's experiential ontology to explore the politics of technology. The process of materializing values in technology takes place against the background of the capitalist heritage. We already have technology that materializes the values of capitalism, and these values are now contested in terms of the life world experiences of ordinary people caught up in the failures of technology. Political struggles have emerged over technology since the 1960s, especially around nuclear issues, medicine, and the environment. The struggles modify the technical disciplines, the objects of these disciplines, and the designs of the technologies stemming from them in terms of potentialities denied by capitalism. Unlike in the 1960s, when Marcuse developed his theory, there is now a great deal of contestation of science and technology. They are subject to much criticism, some justified, some unjustified. And this criticism issues, so we're not finished with this one. This criticism issues in political struggles. For example, the feminist movement resisted traditional childbirth procedures and demanded changes in the treatment of women by medicine. The movement of gay people around AIDS resisted the established methods for experimental medicine. Various environmental movements address concerns about nuclear power, air and water pollution, toxic waste dumps, and eventually, of course, the biggest of them all, climate change. We are now used to social movements altering and changing the scientific technical disciplines that actually determine social life. The notion that there is interaction between the historically changing life world and the sciences is fundamental to Marcuse's thought, and it is fundamental to our situation in ways he did not anticipate. Today, we can apply his concept of successor science, object construction, and translation to all the technical disciplines that actually structure our world. The management sciences that administer us, the food sciences that determine our diet, civil engineering, which builds bridges and automobiles, and medicine, which takes care of our physical health. Interior architecture, which constructs the spaces like the ones we are in, and so on. We need reformed technical disciplines in many fields. The regional ontologies of these disciplines must change in function of changes in the social world. The objects of the technical disciplines are altered by life world concerns and public protests based on those concerns. These successor technical disciplines are not as radically different as Marcuse's imagined new physics, but different enough to improve the quality of life in our technified society. And most importantly, the emergence of political struggle over science and technology promises to keep open the future. That politics is unique because it crosses the gap between the life world and the technical disciplines in both directions. In the example of air pollution, public concern about the health effects of air pollution arose from both personal observation and medical opinion widely shared with the public. This concern eventually reached politicians and regulators. Automotive engineers re-engineered the automobile to take account of air quality. The automobile used to be a means of transportation and a status object, but it has now become a new kind of object, both for consumers and engineers, an environmental object. In order to turn the automobile into this new object, the engineers had to modify their discipline, adding chapters on catalytic converters and fuel injection, and so on. Of course, now electric cars. This is a pattern which appears over and over again as environmental concerns become more and more significant. A two-way process of communication between the life world and science grants meaning to experience and changes the object of science. In the case of climate change, for example, we understand what is happening as the result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our conception of the climate is influenced by science, but science is also influenced by pressures from the life world, pressures to figure out how to mitigate these effects. In both cases, the object, climate, has been transformed. For us, it has taken on properties known to science, while also continuing to concern us as a future environment containing potentialities for human life. For science, the climate is no longer simply an object of observation and prediction, but has become a manipulable object of technical control. Struggles over science and technology have gradually reconfigured the public sphere. This is an enormous change Marcuse could not have anticipated, although it is consistent with his emphasis on the role of science and technology in society. There are dangers in this new situation, such as the anti-vax movement demonstrates. But the last 75 years have brought huge beneficial changes in medicine and environmental politics due to public involvement. These changes are not as visible as the anti-vax movement because the consequences of successful struggles are seen as routine scientific achievements. It seems obvious now that you must have clean air and no one doubts the need for pollution controls. Well, there was a time when doubts were commonplace. Not so long ago, automobile manufacturers were busy spending millions of dollars lobbying governments to prevent what they thought of as expensive and unnecessary pollution controls. There's a fundamental difference between the view I've developed here on the basis of Marcuse's work and his own approach. At the time Marcuse elaborated his theory of one-dimensionality, the legitimating power of technology appeared to be uncontested and uncontestable. Indeed, it was very unusual for publics to engage with science, the sciences and technologies that affected their lives. Marcuse believed that scientific change would occur after a socialist revolution would modify the structure of the life world to bring back a sense of potentialities lost in the dystopia of one-dimensionality. In fact, there is no such dystopia, at least no longer. The life world has retained a sense of potentiality to a greater degree than Marcuse believed likely or possible, and that motivates struggles to preserve and protect both human beings and nature. Where this will lead us, we do not know. Will struggles over science and technology culminate in socialism? We have no clear sense of the future. Whether, as Marcuse supposed, the realization of the potentialities of nature is compatible with capitalism, only time will tell. He writes, quote, "To drive ecology to the point where it is no longer containable within the capitalist framework means first extending the drive within the capitalist framework." End quote. Insofar as the environmental movement and the environmental sciences function in a capitalist society, they are necessarily ambiguous. Even the most radical movements cannot escape this fate. Marcuse writes, quote, "Objective ambivalence characterizes every movement of the radical opposition, an ambivalence which reflects at one and the same time the power of the establishment over the whole and the limits of this power," end quote. In conclusion, Marcuse's thought provokes a new look at Marxism, science, and technology. Marxism is not just about economic trends. Long sections of Marx's Capital, concern technology and its harms and potentials. Today, it is obvious that technology is just as much in play as economics in the transformation of society. But technology has now spread so widely over the surface of society that it is no longer largely confined to factories as it was for Marx. Thus, the demand for technological change is to some extent independent of working class politics and the proletarian revolution as Marx imagined them. Marcuse's theory illuminates the resulting struggles over science and technology. His work offers valuable resources for understanding these struggles. So I'm going to end there, and I'd be very interested in your comments and questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for your talk, and which was so extremely rich with topics and references to a lot of like authors, and especially, of course, Marcuse. But you were mentioning at some point Simondon, and I maybe have a question about it. But please raise your virtual hand first if there are already questions from the audience, and I would like to go first with the question from the other people, then like speaking myself. So just raise your hands so that I can see you, and you can ask Andrew your questions. If there are, like, while you are preparing your own questions, then, because I don't see raised hand yet, well, I will go first then. And you were mentioning at some point, like, yeah, as I was saying, Simondon at some point, and I was intrigued by this reference, Andrew, because at some point you were explaining that this active relation that we engage with the world of meanings comes in the form of labor. And I wanted to ask something about the characterization of this type of relation, like what's the role of mechanization and automation in this? Because I was thinking while you were talking about these contemporary thinkers, especially in the French context, such as Bernard Stiegler and of course Simondon, who also, especially I would say Stiegler, combine a Marxist approach with a phenomenological stance or methodology reference. And they seem to think that the problem here involves precisely this standardization that comes with the automation. And so they elaborate, both of them, I would say, both Simondon and Stiegler, this idea of the, automatization in order to, make individuation play against this, this capitalist trend. And I was thinking if this concept that is so central in Simondon, for example, of individuation plays a role in what you were saying. And also another point that I was reminded of while you were talking is this other one regarding the relationship with phenomenology. And I always felt that, like, a problem with like at least Husserl's theory of technique and technology, or technicization, as he has in the crisis of European sciences, is this idea that kind of seems to think that technology is to some extent a neutral thing, and it doesn't seem the process behind that, like it doesn't see that, of course, once we have a final device or tool or instrument, it already embodies like kind of a struggle between different actors for the best design or result. And this is something that is embodied in technology, and it doesn't seem to like be interested in that. And but I know that this is a central point in your own thinking, for instance, in technosystem. So I was wondering, how do you connect that to what you were saying today regarding Marcuse? Thank you.
Okay, These are complicated questions, but I'll try and respond. Marcuse did not, I don't think, ever really quite figure out what he thought about automation. He was, of course, he believed that automation could reduce the burden of work. And so in that sense, it would be a good thing. He did not have a clear sense, though, of how that would play out. We're now much further along the process. He also was impressed at various times by the notion that Marx, according to which work would become play or would become a kind of fulfilling enterprise for individuals in a socialist society. So I can imagine combining these two notions, automation as taking care of all the dirty work and the good work being becoming more creative and fulfilling. And something like that may be what Marcuse believed, but this is not a major feature of his discussion of technology. He's mainly concerned with the ways in which it operates in capitalist society and the way in which it could be accommodated to a socialist society. So I guess I can't really, I mean, I think that Stigler and Simondon go much further in terms of discussing the question of automation than Marcuse. But I don't think that his position is incompatible with theirs. I think it probably is, in a sketchy way, somewhat similar to theirs. Now, the second question, let me see if I can recall. Can you remind me of your
Yeah, I
second question?
was asking you about this phenomenological or at least
Oh, yeah.
Husserlian,
The question of
neutrality.
neutrality of technology.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a very difficult question because on the one hand, the assumption that technology is neutral seems to remove it from the sphere of public debate. If it's neutral, I mean, there's nothing, then it means it does not incorporate values. It's not value laden. I mean, we don't consider rocks to be a problem. They're just there. And technology would be like any natural object then, simply present in our environment as itself. But of course, in fact, technologies are like any other artifact, value laden. Now, the tricky part is to figure out how the values enter into technology in Marcuse's thought. And he seems to be working primarily from the standpoint of physics and material technologies, that basic technologies like the sort of things that engineers work on. These are the technologies that he seems to be most concerned about in his ontological critique. And these technologies have a quality of neutrality, but that, let me see if I can put this better. The potentialities that we experience in our relationship to nature and to other human beings in everyday life, these potentialities guide us toward solutions to our problems. They, for example, you don't see the world in technical terms. For the most part, you see it in terms of what it wants to be, what it can become in our life world. This is obviously the case with human beings and also to some extent with natural objects. We think of them in terms of cultivation, in terms of their role in our pleasures and entertainments, and in their, of course, and also their dangers. So all these very highly value-laden aspects of our relation to nature are eliminated from natural science. We don't want to have them in our physics. We want to be able to measure things, and you can't measure the pleasure you get on a walk in the woods. So physics, in a sense, then you could say, is neutral because it eliminates values and potentialities from its object. On the other hand, once you eliminate values and potentialities, then you have an instrument that can be used by anyone for any purpose. And this is exactly what capitalism needs. So technology, insofar as it eliminates potentialities, can serve capitalist purposes better than the artifacts produced in pre-modern societies, which are all highly value laden. So in this sense, you could say technology has a kind of neutrality about it. And this might be the sort of thing that was apparent to Husserl in his discussion of Galilean science and its reduction of nature to primary qualities. But of course, Husserl did not discuss the instrumentalization of technology by capitalism. That's not part of his game. Marcuse introduces this as a way to move from Husserl's sort of cosmic view of technology and science to a more socially relevant view. There's still one more point to make here. Of course, our social world is now completely technified. Everything we do, practically everything we do, is tracked by technological systems of one sort or another, or constructed by them. And so in this sense, there's another whole set of issues which I tried to highlight in my talk, which have to do with the technical disciplines that organize everyday life. And in this respect, technologies are value laden through the construction of their object. So this is I gave the example of a seat belt. It's the construction of the automobile includes all sorts of value elements, aesthetic elements, safety concerns, economic concerns. All these things are built in. They're translated from the world of technical specifications, which itself reflects social demands. So, so in this sense, then the question of neutrality has to be treated a bit differently in the technical disciplines, rather than the way it appears in Husserl's discussion of and Marcuse's discussion of natural science.
Thank you for your answers. Andrew, we have one raised hand from Federico Bohem, then we have another one by Charles, and then we have a list to questions in the chat that I will read them out loud later. But first, Federico Bohem, please.
Yes, thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you very much for the talk. I have a very maybe naive and very simple question. In your opinion, what would Marcuse have thought about citizen science? Because you mentioned this relationship between science and power, technology and power, and then people and democracy. So I was wondering what would he have thought about that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's of course a concern of us today, which was not really on the agenda in 1964 or even in 1975. But he did, toward the end of his life, he became concerned about environmental issues, and he supported the environmental movement. He made 2 speeches in the late 70s, just before his death, in which he discusses environmentalism. And I think he's really trying to say things similar to what I was discussing in the later part of my talk, but without the kind of technical details that I was able to bring on the basis of what we now know from science and technology studies about the relation of publics to technology. But clearly he was impressed by the ability of the public to inform scientific and technical decisions in the environmental domain. So I think had he been able to discuss with us citizen science, he probably would have found some merit in it.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, Federico. We have now questions from Charles. Did I see correctly?
Yeah, sorry, I just took my hand down in time. Thank you so much for this talk. I was really interested. I was kind of curious if you could explain or maybe draw some light on the relationship between Marcuse and Freud and how I'm curious as to how Marcuse adopted Freud in a way that as Freud kind of assumes a subject that's independent of the object, and as you can see from Dialectic of Enlightenment with Adorno and Horkheimer, there's a tendency to suggest that there's a ahistorical tendency of the subject reducing the object to itself. So the formal character of capitalism and technology wouldn't necessarily be only capitalist in history, but something ahistorical. How does Marcuse relate to this kind of issue of adopting aspects of Freudianism into a more, loose phenomenological dialectical theory of history that doesn't have ahistorical instinct in it as much?
Well, that's a good question. It's really 2 questions, because Freud's naturalism is quite different from the view of Adorno and Horkheimer. But the answer is, in the case of Freud, that Marcuse simply ignored Freud's naturalism. He overrode it with his own quasi-phenomenological experiential approach. And so he modified certain Freudian concepts. There's a passage in which he says he's going to treat Freud's concepts as ontological concepts. I mean, there's no precedent for this in Freud. He just does it. So he thinks, for example, that the original narcissism of the infant, in which there's no clear separation between subject and object, somehow adumbrates a future adult relationship to nature, which is based on the unity of subject and object rather than the separation that Freud naturalism assumed. So, I mean, there's a whole chapter in my book about this question, and I try to show how Marcuse's experientialism modifies Freud and makes it into a social theory, which Freud really did not intend. Although there is, in Civilization and its Discontents, there is a good deal of social analysis, of interesting social analysis. But Marcuse modifies the scheme. In Freud's view, civilization requires repression, and the more civilized, the more repressed. Freud, therefore, is quite pessimistic about the future of humanity. But Marcuse is able somehow to torque the Freudian concepts in such a way that it's possible to avoid this increase in repression as civilization advances, and to produce a society in which civilization is more advanced, but also less repressed. And this, of course, is where his Marxism comes in, because Marxism tells you that social reality changes. It's not constant, as Freud seemed to think. It's fundamentally, it changes fundamentally, and so does the character structure of human beings as it changes. And this is what makes possible a quasi, something like a utopian possibility of socialism. So that's for Freud. For Adorno and Horkheimer, yes, there is this problem that the métis of Odysseus appears as the emblem of instrumental rationality. And that then makes the theory appear unhistorical. It's as though instrumental rationality, or rationality generally, had a problem, right? And this problem is eternal. It's not located in capitalism, but it's always been there. This is an anthropological thesis, right? It's a sort of philosophical anthropology. Marcuse does not accept this. And in this respect, I think he's far more Marxist than Adorno and Horkheimer. He sees the character structure of human beings and the forms of instrumental action that they engage as socially relative. So capitalism introduces, I mean, there are, of course, anthropological characteristics of the human being. There are many different forms of instrumental action, not just the one that bothers Adorno and Horkheimer, right? It's not just the reduction of the object to something fungible that human beings can dominate and even destroy. That's just one form of instrumental action. There are other types. Cultivation is a fundamental achievement of human beings, right? The ability to cultivate land, to create new forms of animal life, to raise children. These are also forms of instrumental action. They're just different from the one that Horkheimer and Adorno see as dominant in and Marcuse see as dominant in capitalist society. So there's also artistic creation, another form of instrumental action, which engages with the object in a creative rather than a destructive way, and so on. So the problem then is how these different forms of action play out in different social worlds. And that's the theoretical problem that Marcuse addresses when he tries to explain how a socialist society could, through the development of a kind of generalized aesthetic relationship to nature, overcome the problems Horkheimer and Adorno identify in instrumental action.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I think we have two questions are on the chat. So Andrew, I'm gonna read the first question for you. I find myself often frustrated by the lack of engagement of environmental educators and activists on the one hand, and technocratic planners on the other, with method as struggle, with explicit naming of dialectic and ideology of technology and capital. Of course, the broad sense of this critique is in the air, but unnamed. Such critique is constantly co-opted in movements and daily life. What advice do you have for such development of practitioner and popular engagement with Marcuse and your own critiques?
Could you summarize in your own words what you think is being said there? Because it's hard for me to follow.
Oh, you can also read it yourself in the chat, or I can ask the person that wrote the question in the chat to summarize it himself or herself, if he or she is still connected. I think this came from a D person that, well, I don't see her or him.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hello?
yeah.
Yeah, this is David Silverman. Hi, Andrew. Yes, essentially, what I'm asking is, because I do lots of movement as well as practitioner education and so on, in environmental education in particular, but in a number of other contexts, I'm very aware that science and technology studies and the more to the point, your own and Marcuse's and others' more dialectical critiques are not at all explicit in the circles that I work in, even though the ideas greatly influence the conversation, which means that at the end of the day, the people who are attempting to make a change are easily co-opted, it seems to me, not maintaining a radical critique in their work. So my question for you is, how best would you imagine, or examples you may have, of the introduction of these perspectives into popular struggles which are not already influenced by a dialectical tradition? And of course, the flip side of this, I'll give one example briefly. Now, much of my work is concerned with the latest round of nuclear renaissance and nuclear power, and I'm very aware to the degree to which environmental activists and others have abandoned a critical stance in the face of essentially climate fear. And we could talk about that if you'd like, but that's an example for me where it's impossible to bring up most other ideas. The rush to reductionism and simple solutions, both by planners and by activists, is frustrating. Is that helpful?
Well, I think I understand. I think I understand the issue. There is certainly a huge gap between theoreticians and social movements today, perhaps much more than in the 1960s when Marcuse was developing his relationship to the New Left. I guess I don't know the answer to your question. How is it that, how can, I mean, there needs to be a much more general sense of what people are doing when they engage in political action around environmental questions. They need to have a much broader understanding of what they're doing. It's not just about solving this or that problem, but has to do with the human relationship to nature and the terms on which a technologically advanced society can survive. Well, this leads us to all kinds of theoretical issues that I think would, if they were more generally discussed and understood by activists, would make a difference in the ability of the movements to engage a wider public. So, I mean, I think the issues really are huge. They're not just about the environment. They concern every aspect of human life. That's why I call my book Technosystem, because we live in a technosystem. Now, if you imagine, for example, every aspect of racial discrimination treated as a separate aspect, a separate movement, and nobody had any ideas about the nature of discrimination because they were so busy working on each little part of it, the housing discrimination, the workplace discrimination, all these treated as separate movements, that would be a tremendous that would make the movement tremendously weak. And I think something like that has been happening around technology. People don't see the connection between surveillance on the internet and nuclear power. What's the connection? Well, there is a connection. They both stem from a particular way of organizing a technologically advanced society. So what I've been hoping for ever since I first started to write about technology 30 years ago is for the emergence of a sense of an overall movement. And I think this would greatly strengthen all the particular struggles, but it hasn't really happened yet. I'm hoping that if people begin to read Marcuse again, because they used to, but they stopped sometime in the 1980s when Habermas became the leading figure in the Frankfurt School, and for many people, for Marxism. People again begin to read Marcuse, perhaps they will be able to think in terms of an overall movement around science and technology, rather than particular and separate movements.
So thanks for the question, and also to Andrew for the answer. There is another question in the chat, so I would ask Thomas whether he can summarize it or ask the question directly to Andrew. Seems to be not
Hello?
there. Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you, Andrew and Federica. This is really valuable, what you're doing here. So I think about one of the most urgent constrictions of the life world as us here is how our lives, the ubiquity of communications technologies in our life. So how do you, Andrew and Federica, how do you see us, this double-edged sword of the communications technologies, because we're getting to do things like what we do here, yet, the amount of the effects on mental health of social media and living through these constricted ways of having human relationships rather than sitting here on the sofa next to me and having this conversation.
Yes, well, I participated in the very early stages of this development, and so my perspective is a little different from. It's maybe I don't know. People may feel that I have not fully grasped the horror of the present moment. When we began in the 1980s to develop what are now called social networks, they mainly concerned projects of one sort or another, things that we did together. We also had home pages where we could present ourselves, but those were separate from the project operations that we engaged in as groups on the existing platforms. Those platforms didn't do anything really except let us talk to each other. There were no algorithms guiding us. There was no system for broadcasting on a vast scale, such as exists now with things like Twitter. And so that was the origin, and it seemed to us very positive. We had very great hopes for the emergence of new forms of community and social interaction and educational experiments and so on. What's happened in, say, the last 15 years or so is the combination of home pages and group communication have been merged by Facebook into a single entity. And this entity is organized not around projects, but around personality. So I have a home page which tells about my work. And on Facebook, I also have a page which tells about my work. There's no sense of project activity in most of what goes on in in these social networks. And this then creates a scene on which advertising and manipulation become very important, and psychological problems of a new sort emerge around the obsessive behavior of people on the networks. So we've moved from a rather positive attempt to create new forms of human interaction to a much more damaging form. Can we recover? I mean, there are people who are working hard to try and figure out how to reconstruct the internet as once again a peer-to-peer operation rather than a corporate system dominated from above. This is a democratic task, and it is an example of the sort of thing that I talked about in the talk. We need a transformation, a successor science of the internet, a transformation of the underlying technology that's guided by different values from the commercial values that inspire Facebook and Twitter and the other monsters that now control these systems.
Thank you both for the question and the answer. It's interesting that in the written form of the question in the chat, you were, Thomas, mentioning Han. And I actually, like, on this very topic, as Andrew knows, I wrote an article comparing Han's theory of, or philosophy of technology, and Andrew Finberg's. And it's really interesting to see how both of them like actually work very, very differently with this idea of ubiquity, and also like the way technology influences our minds and bodies. So I have my own, critical stance against Han, but I will not deepen into that now. And I will just, well, there is Caterina del Sordo, who also raised her hand.
Yes. Thank you very much, Andrew, for this talk. And also thank you very much, Federica, for your questions and organization. I have only historico-philosophical curiosity, I would say. We discussed at least partially about the connection between Marcuse's thought and Freud. Relevantly on the concept of nature. And I would like to ask or know whether Marcuse's thought could be also interestingly discussed in connection with Ernst Mach's philosophical thought. I mean, Mach shared with Freud a common teacher in Vienna, Ernst Bücker, and Mach explicitly paved the way towards a strong philosophical diminishing of the subject-object distinction. So I would like to know whether Mach's neutral monism in this sense could be proficiently discussed in light of Marcuse's concept of nature. And this is just also for me to know whether we already may have or count on researches in this direction, and whether it could be in future interested to develop them. Thank you very much.
I need a little help because the sound is not so good on my computer. Are you talking about Ernst Mach?
Yes.
The German thinker who inspired Einstein with his notion?
Yes.
Well,
Yes, I mean, this is just because Mach explicitly developed a path in ontology and epistemology to avoid the subject-object distinction, and this I find it very familiar with the idea of nature that you presented in the talk. So I would like to know whether we may find some works or researches that discussed, the theoretical relationship between Marcuse's idea of nature and the neutral monism of Mach. Yeah.
Well, I don't recall Marcuse ever mentioning Mach in his work. He was much more involved with Dilthey and phenomenology. I think Mach is really maybe a generation earlier than his influence was perhaps not as great as that of the phenomenologists by the time Marcuse was studying. So I guess I can't really answer your question, but in terms of the general problem of subject-object relation, as it is developed in Dilthey and in Husserl and Heidegger, there's certainly a very strong influence on Marcuse. Now, if in some more general sense, Mach belongs also to this constellation of thinking, then you could perhaps make the connection. But,
It
yeah,
is very problematic to know how Mach may belong to a common constellation together with Husserl, and this is very problematic also from Mach's scholarship, I think. So
I see. Well, Marcuse's sort of his appropriation of phenomenology and other early trends in German philosophy from his time as in the university is very loose. It's not like he's doing phenomenology as people understood it in the school developed by Husserl or Heidegger. So it's a very generalized kind of experiential ontology that he never really works out in the kind of detail that you find in thinkers like Mach or Husserl or Heidegger, who are trying to develop a whole philosophy around their conception of the relation of subject to object. So, I mean, you could look for a relationship, but it's a bit tricky, I think, to try and make the connection.
thank you very much.
Yeah. Your office looks like mine.
Caterina's office.
I mean, sorry, I regret for this. But I don't like the virtual screen that you could put behind you, and so I prefer this.
The real one. Okay, so I don't see any left raised virtual hands, so I guess if there are no further questions, I will just stop here and just let me thank again Andrew for your talk and for being with us. And it was a really, really extremely interesting and rich and productive meeting and event with you. And I will, of course, as we agreed on, send you the record in the next days, the WeTransfer, so that you can use it and share it. And I also thank everybody who joined us today, this evening here in Europe, and your morning, Andrew, in California. And thank you so much to everybody, and especially again to you, Andrew.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was very interesting.
Great. Hope to see you soon in Florence then.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Great. Kind of promised. Okay. So speak soon, and good evening, or have a good day, everyone, everywhere around the world, I would say. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.